The Federal Highway Trust Fund is a pot of money used to finance major highway infrastructure projects, and it is running out of cash yet again. Advocates have long called for a multi-year highway finance bill from Congress, but neither house on Capitol Hill has so far put forward a long-term solution that they can agree on. Now this conversation is happening in the middle of another potential shutdown of the federal government. With me in the studio to talk about how this affects the state of New York is Mike Elmendorf. He's from the Associated General Contractors of New York State. Welcome back to Capitol
Thank
tonight.
You. Good to be
Someday
back.
we will talk about something else.
Yeah, I know. This is like a Groundhog Day thing. Every few months we go to the brink of doom with the Federal Highway Trust Fund, and we come out and talk about. We should just rerun one of the old interviews, maybe.
And then you and I could go out for coffee.
That would work. Yeah.
So the reality, though, is that there was a short-term fix, a 3-month fix that was agreed to over the summer.
Yes.
The president was, not thrilled. I don't think anyone was thrilled.
Nobody's
really.
thrilled. It's better than not having it, right?
Oh,
but
yeah.
I mean, it's been 10 years since we've had a bill longer than 2 years, and I've lost count on how many extensions they've had. And the good news is with an extension is you don't run out of money. Although the fund is running out of money. That's a different. There's sort of two problems right now. One is you don't have a bill, and the other is that the Federal Highway Trust Fund is basically insolvent. The good news, if you will, is that the U.S. DOT announced last week that it's not going to run out of money at the end of the year. Instead, it's going to run out of money in March
next year.
Which I'm not sure if that's really meant to make people feel any better about what is or isn't going on this front in Washington. But what it means almost certainly is that Congress will now take
another short-term solution,
and they'll do it later. There was some encouraging signs of late. I had the opportunity to be with Speaker Boehner a few weeks ago, and I was with Chairman Schuster from the House T&I Committee, Congressman from Pennsylvania, a couple of times over the summer. Both of them were pretty confident that you'd have a bill by October at the latest, and now it looks like that timeline is once again slipping away.
Extended. Okay, so here's the problem. I mean, the problem is transportation and infrastructure funding is so important, as we've discussed so many times on this show, and we're sort of blue in the face discussing it. That said, it always gets shunted aside as like sexier conversations happen. So right now you have a controversy going on about funding for Planned Parenthood and whether or not the conservatives are going to succeed in holding up the funding. And if they do, they say they're not going to vote for any extension, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? And then we're going to get to the shutdown crisis, and it'll be an 11th hour deal, and because that's usually what happens. Because it's good for no one when they shut down the government, really, almost no one. The problem is, though, that, what are you hearing? Have you spoken to the leadership lately? We've spoken to some members of Congress, most recently Tom Reed, and he seems confident that they're going to get somewhere. And Boehner's comments have been confident as well. But, they get somewhere on a funding agreement does not mean they get somewhere on transportation.
Right. We've heard, when you talk to people about this, first of all, everyone supports it, right? You don't find too many people either at the federal level or at the state level who don't agree that we need to invest in infrastructure. It's one of the core purposes of government, as a matter of fact. But the trouble is when you get to the fun question of how are you going to pay for it? Right. And that's when everybody seems to part company and the eyes start, darting around looking for the door. We've talked to Congressman Reed. We have a lot of really good, strong leaders on this issue in the New York delegation. But the trick is getting the institution, getting both houses to come together on a bipartisan basis, set aside the politics, set aside the games of you don't want to let the person or the party in control now get the win, and just govern. How about that for a change? Govern, make some tough decisions, because the other problem here is you're talking about a huge amount of money. Mm-hmm. It is tens of billions of dollars. The Federal Highway Trust Fund, I think, is in the hole to the tune of almost $80 billion. And that's real money. And when you try to figure out where to come up with it, that's also a real political problem.
Okay, so I'll just sort of bring up some old chestnuts, like the gas tax, for example, right? And that's one that we've had discussions about before. Nobody seems to want to touch that.
It's been a long time since the gas tax was increased. There are states that have done it, actually. Now, unlike New York, there are states that have a lower gas tax to begin with, so they have the room to move. And we've had a lot of discussions here at this table about how the gas tax revenue in New York actually isn't really going where it's supposed to go, so that's a whole other issue. Doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite for a gas tax increase in Congress at this point. There's some in the Democratic Party who would support it. Frankly, there are some Republicans who I talked to privately who say that they would support it, but as a body, I just don't see that happening at this point.
So then borrowing, it's going to be borrowing?
Well, the big conversation, at least in the House now, is about repatriation. There is a school of thought that if you make some changes to the federal tax code, you can bring back onshore some corporate earnings that were offshored because of disadvantages to the tax code previously, that would create a pretty significant burst of revenue, although it's not really sustained revenue as I understand it. It sort of gets you through the immediate crisis, and that's the problem. They keep going out, they did a couple of rounds of pension smoothing,
Right.
where they would smooth out, payments into the federal pension plans, and it didn't really create new money. It was sort of an accounting trick because you were not having to pay for something now that you thought you were going to have to pay for.
Yeah, and then the problem is also
none of these are sustainable.
You're heading into a presidential year where nobody wants to do anything. I mean, you don't want to talk about, I don't want to harp on the gas tax, it's certainly not the only idea out there, but you don't want to talk about raising taxes. I mean, Donald Trump has some unorthodox ideas in terms of taxing, which is, not necessarily in keeping with some of the more fiscally conservative ideas of some of his other Republican candidates.
I'm trying not to laugh.
I know you are. I know. Hey, he's the front runner right now. So, I mean, it's just, don't you think it's going to get increasingly difficult the closer we get into 2016?
A political year never makes anything easier, much less something that the Congress has been unable to do successfully for a decade, basically, right? But the problem is something has to give here, because it's not just that I'm tired of talking about it and you're probably tired of hearing about the same thing every few months when this happens. But it's a real problem for the state DOT, for all the states, for local governments, and for our industry, because you can't plan.
Right.
If you don't know what's going to happen, if you don't know what kind of funding you're going to have and what kind of projects are going to be out there, the agencies can't plan on the government side. They can't do design. They can't be prepared to go forward with projects. And the industry can't plan in terms of staffing and equipment and material production and things like that. It's a real problem, and we don't even need to talk about the need. I mean, I think everybody understands who
right.
drives around and has been, awake in the last few years that infrastructure is falling apart.
If you're not awake, you're awakened by the bumps that are occurring under your car.
It's a big problem.
The big question that we always come back to is, what does it mean for the Tappan Zee, which is the biggest project that's going on, one of the biggest projects in the country, the biggest project that's going on certainly in New York, and we still don't have a financing plan.
I don't know that this particular discussion has much impact on what's going on the Tappan Zee Bridge, which, by the way, is extraordinary. I was down there last week out on a boat with a tour with Tappan Zee constructors and some of our leadership, and it is simply incredible
and on
the
time
work that they are doing
so far.
Yeah, that's what we hear. That's a slightly different type of project because it's a Thruway Authority project. There are a lot of questions about the financing.
Money, right.
There's the TIFIA loan, but that's not really impacted by what's happening with the trust fund. So it's not really an issue there, but it is an issue for New York State DOT and for local governments all over the state that have huge needs. I mean, by the comptroller's own numbers, over the next 20 years, we have about a $90 billion gap in terms of what we expect, if you just assume things are level, will be out there to invest in infrastructure and what we need. And if you look at what we're spending now compared to what we spent a decade ago, and you adjust for inflation, we're actually spending less on our roads and bridges than we were spending a decade ago.
So what can the state do? I mean, are we going to reignite the debate, do you think, over thruway tolls? I mean, obviously this issue regarding the Tappan Zee and tolls, let's set that aside for a second, but the money has to come from somewhere. The state is going to have to invest. If it can't get money from the feds, which is slowly sort of deteriorated over time in terms of federal transportation investment, it has to do something to keep the roads drivable.
Well, there's two distinct issues. The thruway is the thruway, and the thruway always has been a toll-supported system, and that's really what it should be. And there was an infusion of $1.4 billion to the Thruway Authority this past year.
That's to avoid toll
hikes. A lot of
hikes.
that had to do with the Tappan Zee Bridge, but also to avoid toll hikes. I think that's something that we would have real concerns if we see that happening on a recurring basis, because the state has its own assets that the DOT is responsible for, which they have nowhere near the resources to get to the kind of condition that they need to be in. I mean, we have about 6,000 bridges. I'm sorry, we have about, what's the number? I'm losing my figures here. About a third of our bridges are
that's the figure.
Are deficient, or in other words, in need of repair.
Right.
We have a lot of major roads in the state that are in very poor condition. These are by the governor's own numbers in the State of Opportunity booklet last year. And there's some encouraging signs there, because the governor now is talking about the MTA. We agree that the MTA has very significant needs too, and they've done a very good job of getting out there and actually talking about them, right? They're able to put their needs out.
Yes, but it's falling prey to the fight between Mayor de Blasio, Governor Cuomo, and Tom Pendergrass.
They're making progress. So the governor's come out and basically committed to making a multi-billion-dollar additional investment in the MTA. We don't, but here's the trick. What most people may not realize, if you're watching in Syracuse tonight or wherever you might be, you probably don't know you're paying for the MTA. Because when you go and you fill up your car at the pump, part of the gas tax revenue that you are generating into the state goes to mass transit. Even though you may never go down to New York City and hop on the subway, you're paying for it. And that's part of a deal that was struck a couple of decades ago when the dedicated fund was created. Shortly thereafter, the MTA had needs, and the deal was that part of the gas tax revenues would go to the MTA, but that there would be parity, more or less, between what was being spent on transit and what was being spent on roads and bridges. And by and large, that's how it was until 2009, when that historic deal was broken. The MTA is now $5 or $6 billion ahead of where the DOT system is. And so the hope is, with the governor now stepping up and saying we've got to do something for the MTA,
There will be
it's an
parity.
opportunity to have a conversation about getting back to parity, because it's important. There are those who complain about investing in the MTA. They're wrong. It's an important system. It's critical to the state's economy. We need to do it, but we need to take care of the rest of the state too, and we've been lagging behind.
Okay, so we will have the conversation again. It's nice to see you. We'll see you in a
Nice to
few
see you.
months.
We'll just talk about the same stuff.
Mike Elmendorf, thank you so much. When we come back, we'll keep the conversation